Cool. Ben Barkow, welcome to LetsDoHumans podcast.
Well, thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah, well, I came to your home.
You came to me.
Thank you for
Great to have
inviting me
you
to your
here.
home. Yeah, thanks for having me here. First of all, before we start, do you mind if I just ask you, how's retirement treating you?
Retirement is very good. I'm enjoying it a lot.
Yeah.
I stopped work just about 2 months ago.
Oh, okay.
And the very first week, I was a bit lost. Didn't know what to do with myself.
I can
But
imagine.
since then, I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
They're pretty busy. I think I mentioned to you, I decided to retire about a year ago, so I had plenty of time to think about the kinds of things I wanted to get involved with, and I took on a load of stuff, and so I'm busy and I'm liking it a lot.
Okay, fantastic. Do you find that you're in more demand now since you retired in terms of
I really am.
Yeah.
I had not expected that, but it's really true. Yeah, and the people emailing me and ringing me up and wanting things.
People like myself.
That was a nice surprise as well. Yeah. But it's really, really interesting and good. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Do you mind telling us what was you doing prior to reretirement? So what was your previous role?
Yeah. So for the last 20 years, I was a director of a place called the Wiener Library, which has just changed its name to the Wiener Holocaust Library.
Okay.
And as the name suggests, that's a library, an archive about the Holocaust and genocide.
Yeah.
And it's the oldest organization anywhere in the world set up specifically to document the Holocaust.
Okay.
It actually was set up in Amsterdam in 1933 by a man called Alfred Vena, and that's why it's called the Wiener Library. And he brought it over to the UK just a few weeks, 2 or 3 weeks before the Second World War started.
Oh, wow. Okay. So how did you get into that line of work, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, sort of slightly by accident, actually. Yeah. So my first first proper serious job was as a research assistant at the Wellcome Institute for the History of Medicine. And so I was doing that for about 3 or 4 years. Yeah. And then I got very fed up with it, bored with it, and I left. And I wasn't sure what to do, and I was doing kind of freelance bits and pieces to keep going. And then I heard that there was a temporary job going at this place for 3 months, and took it. I wasn't very thrilled about it, but I thought it was 3 months' money, so that'll do me.
Yeah.
And
why wasn't you thrilled, if you don't mind me asking?
I had never, up to that point, I hadn't really given much thought to the Holocaust, or it didn't interest me in particular. And I found like the place itself was very gloomy and a bit depressing, and I just didn't like it all that much. But because of my family background, I knew, a certain amount, and thought, well, I ought to know more about it than I actually did at that time. And bit by bit, over a period of maybe 2 or 3 years, I got interested in it.
Yeah, is this while you're working there?
While I was working there full time for 3 months, and then at the end they said, there's always bits and pieces to do here. So if you've got days and you want to work here, that's fine.
Yeah.
It gave me this sort of terrible day rate.
Yeah.
But it kept me going, and I was doing other things on the side as well. And so I carried on like that for as I said, 2 or 3 years. And then bit by bit I came to realize, actually, I get this, and this is not just an academic interest. It's because of my family's history, and we can talk about that a bit. This is very relevant to me, and I'd really like to get in here with a proper full-time job, and that wasn't so easy to do. So I had to wait. Probably took me about 18 months to persuade them, and then they gave me this job. My first job proper job there was running their photo archive,
Okay.
which, as you can imagine, is not the easiest thing.
Yeah.
The kind of photos they had were very, very horrible and difficult. And it just sort of went on from there.
Yeah.
So altogether, I worked for that outfit for 32 years.
Oh wow! Amazing.
And I was director of it for just under 20 years.
Oh wow! Amazing. So you managed to work your way up then pretty quickly
I
from
did,
a hobby, from a part-time job up into a director.
Yeah.
You said something interesting in regards to how you view the Holocaust prior to actually directly getting involved, and that's probably one of the reasons why I wanted you on the podcast, because the word Holocaust has always run through my mind. I've always come across various bits of information and content online regarding the Holocaust,
Sure.
whether it will be from a historic point of view or people's opinions of what the Holocaust was and what actually did happen during the Holocaust. I've never truly felt like I've understood the Holocaust. Like I've always felt like it's been vaguely explained throughout my academic life,
Right.
and throughout media, various documentaries I've watched. It's always a case where something happened, loads of people lost their lives in terrible circumstances, but as in the process of how we got to that stage, I've never truly understood it. So I think one of the questions I wanted to ask you, and because I have a lot of young viewers, is just how would you explain the Holocaust to someone, from someone who's had an in-depth experience?
Yeah. So one thing I would say before that is, I've been working with this subject for over 30 years, and I don't understand it either.
Yeah.
Because there's something about it that you just can't get to grips with, why people would do this. But, roughly speaking, what the Holocaust is the systematic persecution and murder of the Jews in Europe, and to some extent other groups, so particularly what people commonly called gypsies, more properly called Sinti and Roma, and to some extent gay people and the disabled and other groups as well, but chiefly European Jews. And it started with legal restrictions on what they could do, what jobs they could have, where they could live. They bit by bit, the Nazi regime took away all of their freedoms. At a certain point, you weren't allowed even to have a cat anymore, and you had to get rid of your cat, but you weren't allowed to give it to anybody else. They insisted that you put your cat down. And then you couldn't ride on buses and all the rest of it. And then eventually they started deporting them into other countries. The Holocaust proper really goes with the Second World War. It's like the war was the cover for carrying this out. You couldn't do it in peacetime.
It kind of served as a perfect cover during that period as well.
Exactly, I think so. And so then they pushed all the Jews out of Germany and Austria into countries like Poland. They built these special camps and put people in there, but also they just took loads and loads of people. They would go, particularly after the invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 41, they would just go into little villages, take the people out, march them into the nearest forest or just out into the fields and shoot them. And about half the people who were murdered in the Holocaust were shot face to face. So you often...
So that's about 3 million people.
It's getting on for, it's up to about half. But people often think the Holocaust was sort of industrial, like a factory industrialized killing. And that was happening in the death camps, but at the same time or before it, people were just gunning them down in vast numbers.
It's great you actually brought up the point regarding taking people to the fields and gunning them down. So prior to meeting you here today, I wanted to speed read something and try and get up to date. But what I always try and do is I try and come from a different angle in terms of the content I'm consuming. So I read a book called Ordinary People. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the book.
Who's it by?
Is it
Ordinary Men?
Ordinary Men, sorry.
Ordinary Men, Christopher Browning. Sure, it's a great book.
So I wasn't able to finish it because I was trying to rush it the last couple of days before coming here. And the reason why I read the book is because I wanted to understand how people allowed this to happen and how some people partook in the act of killing
Yeah.
other individuals in a genocide manner. And for those who have read the book and understand the concept behind the book, is that ordinary men were picked out from various sectors. So they could have been bakers, farmers, bus drivers, whatever they were, and then they were forced and given an option, and that was to either kill or be killed. And I'm sure, as you know, most of those men ended up becoming assassins for the Nazi regime.
Yeah.
So, what the question I'm trying to get to is, what drives people to commit genocide? What is the driving factors behind it?
Yeah, well, it's a very, it's a really important question, and there's no easy, straightforward answer to it at all. But in the case of that book, what he was studying was a particular group of men from Hamburg in Germany who had belonged to a police formation. Yeah. So these were quite elderly blokes. They weren't young men. They were kind of middle-aged. Some were probably, in their 40s and 50s. And they weren't forced to do this. Yeah, they were taken out, and I think they were in the Soviet Union somewhere. And but if any one of them said, "Look, I can't do this," that was fine. Yeah, and then they'd be sent somewhere else, not somewhere worse necessarily, but they weren't forced to do it. But they let themselves be caught up in this, and they went along with it. And some people, now the range of sort of motivations for people to get involved with it is quite wide. So some people really believed it. They really believed this Nazi propaganda that the Jews were the source of everything bad in the world, and they were all conspiring together to keep everybody else down. So they really bought into that story and thought they were, making the world free. And other people, frankly, thought, I can make money out of this. We can nick all their stuff and all of this sort of thing, and we can make money out of this. And other people were just maybe too weak. They were easily led and got caught up in it and just went along with it. And actually, it's very difficult if you're in a group of people and they all pushing you in one direction. Very hard to hold out against that. Even when it's something as as extreme and terrible as killing people.
And I think especially if you think you can get away with it as well, I think that becomes another factor in of pushing that part of the human nature to come out.
And I think it's very important, and that's why that book is so great and so important, is to understand that these weren't special kinds of people. They weren't mad, they weren't evil. These were ordinary blokes, and they could be led to do this. And what I think everybody's got to think about is, well, what would I have done? If I'd been caught up in that. And I've thought about that a lot for myself. And I might like to think that, I would have held out against it, or I would have rescued people or whatever. But you can't be sure.
You definitely can't. That was a question because I haven't finished the book. I just quickly tried to go through it prior to meeting you, and I'm definitely going to finish it now after speaking to you. It was a question I asked myself. I was like, what if I was there at the time? I was a particular man of a particular age, of a particular race, and I was put in that situation. Like, it's easy to say it with hindsight and having the mindset that I have now and having to review history. And as we know, through history we learn and we're trying to better ourselves as human beings. But when you're in that environment, how would you know how to act?
How would you know?
How would you know what's right and what's wrong and what you should be doing? You might know what's right and what's wrong, but in terms of your
actually
actions,
doing it. That's right. And it's not, I don't think it's the case that those people who did help other people to survive, that they were, that there wasn't one thing that they all had in common. It's not like they were all good Christians or something. That's not the case at all. Some of them were, some of them weren't. And it's there's very difficult to identify common features that the killers have and that the rescuers have as well. You just don't know. You just don't know how people are going to respond
to that.
And from many stages of the Holocaust, but even right early on, say in 1938, in November 1938 in Germany, they organised this big sort of attack on the Jews, and they destroyed the businesses and smashed up their homes, and it's known as the November pogrom. And one of the most disturbing things about that was how often it was the people living next door who came for you, people you knew. You knew you'd been living amongst them for years, and they would turn on their neighbours and beat them and rob them, and in many cases kill them.
It kind of highlights again how dangerous spewing certain rhetorics are. Because we're under the assumption that it's okay for everyone to kind of like have their being sort of like their group setting and just it's us against them type of thing. But when push comes to shove and it goes into the really far end where it becomes violent, it's very easy to turn on someone that you might potentially loved previously. And that's the dangers of it. So let's going back to where you worked again. In terms of like some of the stuff the organisation was doing, can you tell me a bit more about it? What
doing in my time?
Yes, during your time.
Mainly we collect books and papers. So
is this original
books? There's every year there's literally thousands of books published about different aspects of the Holocaust, and the library buys some of these books, don't buy them all, buys some of these books, so keeps up to date with the scholarly research into the whole subject. And at the same time they're building up this archive of original documents, and the kind of thing that they're doing on that side is collecting family papers from people who came to Britain as refugees, or people who were survivors and settled in Britain afterwards, and also the records of organisations that were involved in trying to get people out or resettle them or bring children over. So you probably heard of something that happened in late 38 and 39 called Kindertransport. So there's a lot of stuff about Kindertransport in the library. And also, increasingly, we get digital material. So, in fact, must be about 5 years ago now, we got a digital copy of an absolutely immense archive called the International Tracing Service. And this is a body of records that was built up towards the end of the war and then throughout the 50s and 60s, and even now they're still adding things to it. And the point of it was to help people trace relatives and friends that they had lost contact with.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah. And this collection is absolutely vast. So it's got 100 million pages of documentation.
Wow.
And you can find information about what happened to 17.5 million people during the war. And the library got the digital copy of that. And that means not only that we're helping lots and lots of people who find out about their parents or their grandparents or whatever, but also more and more it's academics and students who want to get access to this to study, because there's a lot of information in there that people haven't known before.
Oh, amazing. What is that's great. So what is the importance of history to you? So in terms of like general history and then obviously the history of the Jews, like why as human beings do we find history so intriguing?
Well, of course, it is just really intriguing in itself to find out how people lived, whether it's 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago. It's just interesting. And then this kind of history, there is always this idea that we can learn from it and then we won't make the same mistakes. But it looks to me like we do make pretty much the same kind of mistakes.
I mean, some would even compare what's happening in China at the moment and the Muslims. So
it's very serious. So that's a real challenge. But I think if you don't look at history, then you'll make those mistakes on an even worse scale. So you have to do what you can, and I think it's it's quite difficult to define, what are the lessons of the Holocaust. I mean, in some way I would say, well, the lessons of the Holocaust are that if you're a really bad man and you want to hold on to power, this is a good way to do it. Pick on some group, persecute them, then start murdering them. You'll stay in power. No one is going to try and stop you, and you'll probably never go to court for it afterwards. So that might be, a lesson of the Holocaust, but it's not a good lesson, obviously. And the real challenge is that you've got to think about what happened there and how is that relevant today? Because it's essentially the same kind of society. It's a modern, industrialized, wealthy society where this took place, and realize how, in a way, vulnerable we all are as individuals, but we are as a society and as a culture to being drip-fed these messages that those people are bad, or you should really be hating those people. And we're seeing a lot of it now. I mean, of course, you just mentioned China, and there's very bad things going on there with persecution of the Uyghur. Today I was reading that I can't remember which one of the African countries, Gambia, I think it was.
Continue.
Has taken Burma to court, saying that the persecution of the Rohingya is a genocide. And there have been many genocides since the Holocaust. Many.
I mean, we had Rwanda. Genocide in Rwanda. We've had Nigeria. And
Yugoslavia and so on. So it goes on. Darfur. So we need to try and understand what is it in our society that makes us so vulnerable to this. And I would say it's really sort of urgent now, because there are signs that really extreme political views are becoming very popular again. You've got the problem of the Labour Party being anti-Semitic and not doing anything about it. You've got the problem of the Tory Party being Islamophobic, and they're not doing very much about it. And the kind of really hate speech that someone like Donald Trump comes out with is really scary.
And I think, to touch on that as well, I think what's making it worse as well, and what's heightening it, is probably social media as well, because it's giving us a platform right now to now go into our tribal states, and it's creating more tribal states within the cultural sphere, and we're more vocal about it now. It's easy to get messages out there now, whilst before you could start off a revolution somewhere in a corner in a town hall, whilst now all you have to do is send out a tweet to hundreds of thousands of people, and you're going to find someone who believes in whatever it is you're saying, whether it's hate towards another group of human beings or another set of gender or whatever it is it may be. So to me, I think social media is kind of heightening it right now.
I think what social media is doing is it's kind of accelerating the whole process. There's much more, there's much more of it, and it's much quicker. In fact, it's virtually instant. But allowing for that, what's going on is not so dissimilar to what was going on, say, immediately after the First World War. So in Germany, right after the First World War, there were loads of very small but very organised groups of very right-wing people who were quite well networked into each other. They worked together sometimes. They had plenty of money from different sources, and they were pumping out masses and masses and masses of propaganda saying, the Jews are really destroying the country, and we need to actually have another war to sort out, the mess that the First World War has created for us, and this sort of thing. And they were reaching hundreds of thousands and millions of people, much like we are today, but it took a little longer. So there are big differences, but there are also really big similarities as well. So the content of it hasn't really changed much, but the way it spreads around has changed, and is quicker and can reach further. And you see that in things like the propaganda that was there in the run-up to the European elections last summer.
Yeah.
So I read somewhere that there were little right-wing groups dotted about Europe that were setting up Facebook pages.
Yeah.
Yep. And these started out being about the kinds of things that young people might be interested in, so music or sport or fashion or whatever, that type of stuff. And after they built up a following with that content,
They start pushing the propaganda.
then they start pushing the propaganda, white supremacy and anti-Semitism and the rest. And by the time the European elections had took place, millions of people had interacted with those pages.
Yeah.
And that's got to, that's going to make a difference. Those people have got that kind of poisonous stuff in their minds now. Whether what they do with it is another question, but it's quite easy to reach out to people and tell them all this stuff.
Yeah. In relations to what you just mentioned now, so again, when I was doing my research, I typed in Holocaust. So you can type in Holocaust anywhere, like on Google, whatever. And there's a subgroup of individuals who completely deny it happened. So I mean, I laugh at the prospect, but then I know that there's individuals out there that are not laughing and taking that information seriously, because we document history. We've got quite a good way of tracking history. We've got live physical evidence of things that happened during history. So why is there such a big group and a set of individuals that are completely denying it? I mean, I get the agenda behind it. I get the possible agendas, what they're thinking, but what is their reasoning? Like, I couldn't get my head around it, because this is the first time I came across it, and I was like, this doesn't make sense.
Yeah, in a way it doesn't make sense, but it is interesting that any time there is a genocide, if it's the Holocaust or if it's the Uyghur in China or the Rohingya in Burma, any genocide, any time, any place, it will always be denied.
Yeah.
And there's some scholars have sort of described 8 or 10 stages that every genocide goes through. And denial is always part of it. Yeah, you deny that you're thinking about doing it, you deny it while you're doing it, and you deny it after you've done it. So, and in a way, I would say denial is so much part of genocide that if there's an atrocity, if they're not denying it, it's not genocide.
Okay.
You could almost say, if they're denying it, that's a warning that this is probably genocide. It
has to be a part of the process.
It has to be part of it is a part and parcel of the process. And what people, why they're doing it is because if they can discredit the evidence that this was real, they'll be able to do it again. And that's what they want.
Yeah.
That's what they want. No doubt about it. It's not, they're not saying we think this is, it wasn't as bad as that or whatever. They're not interested in that. They're saying we just want to do it again.
Wow. It's difficult to understand, because there's truth and then there's opinion, and then so sometimes it's hard to balance the two. Like for me, I'm like, why are we allowing there to be a balance between ultimate truth and just pure opinion? Yeah. And
now there was the most famous Holocaust denier in Britain was a guy called David Irving. I don't know if you've heard of him. He started out as a fairly respectable historian writing about the Second World War, and then sometime in the 1980s he got into Holocaust denial, and there was in the year 2000 there was a big court case in Britain because an academic wrote about him as being a Holocaust denier, and he sued them for libel.
Oh.
And this was a huge case, and he lost it. And that, I've forgotten why I've started on this story now.
I think you're talking about how he got into Holocaust denialism and his process.
No, I'm going to have to get back to that.
That's fine. That's absolutely fine. Yeah. One thing. So, to me, with the Holocaust deniers, it also comes in line with a group of people who've created a stereotypical ideal of what a Jew is.
Sure.
And you always hear the rhetorics that Jewish are money hungry, they're this, they're that, and so forth. So what is the history of that? Because when I look into stereotypes, so there's stereotypes on everybody. There's stereotypes on black boys.
Absolutely.
Like when people see me, they don't, without knowing who I am as an individual, they might have an idea, they might have a preconceived notion of who I might possibly be. Yep. It's only once they get to know me, or once they get to know maybe my family or my background, then that idea changes. But before that, visually and just seeing me for who I am, there's always a preconceived notion, which is birthed historically through whatever propaganda, through historical events or whatever it is. What is the Jewish journey?
Well, right. Well, it really starts with Christianity. That's where it starts, and in particular, I think it starts in the 4th century BC, when Christianity was taken up as the official religion of the Roman Empire. And at that point, the Christian church started to turn against the Jews. And I mean, to begin with, Christians were just a Jewish sect. You know, all Jews didn't believe exactly the same stuff. There were different groups and sects like there are in any other religion. And Jesus was one of those. But once it really separated off from Judaism and became the state religion of the Roman Empire, they kind of then started attacking the Jews and saying, well, actually, you know, it was the Jews who killed Christ. It was their fault that Christ died, which in fact, you know, is completely untrue. I mean, it was the Romans who killed Christ. And then they identify Judas Iscariot as being, you know, he was a Jew, yes, and he sold Christ out for 30 pieces of silver. And I think that's part of why Jews will betray you and they'll do it for money. And that became quite, you know, powerful all through the Christian countries as it spread around, and it really stuck. So persecuting Jews and not giving them equal rights was absolutely there throughout Europe, all the way through. You know, all the way through from the earliest days until, you know, like in Germany, they got full equal rights in about the 1920s. And so that Christian anti-Semitism was a huge history, and there's no other group actually that has been got at and attacked for over such a massive period of time, 2,000 years. And then in the 19th century, and it happened in Germany, there was a movement to say, we're not interested in Christian anti-Semitism because we don't believe in Christianity anymore, but we think Jews are actually a different race from the rest of us. And then they became this sort of racial anti-Semitism, and it said essentially, you know, something like, well, they're not genetically the same as us, you know, so they're always going to be, they're always plotting against us, and they want to take over the world, and they want to control everything, and wherever you look, you know, there's always Jews behind. You know, the man in power, behind him is a group of Jews manipulating him and this sort of thing. So it really got going that way, and always it flares up. Like if economic times are bad, or if there's a war or something, it flares up because everybody is then looking for somebody to blame. Why is my life so terrible now? Why has all my money disappeared? It must be somebody's fault. And then along come right-wing extremists or Nazis or whoever and say, well, actually it's them over there. Look at them. They're the ones who've done it.
Yeah, it's always easier to point the finger probably at the Oriental other than to point it at yourself.
It absolutely is. Yeah. It absolutely is. And it's amazing how easy it is to do that. And I mean, I've had times in my life when I've had those feelings.
Yeah. Well, you feel people have directed something that's going wrong in their life towards you?
No. I mean, I've gone along with thinking, okay. It must be, it's all the fault of Asians or something, And then you think, am I going mad?
Yeah, I think if you don't admit there's a human, you're probably lying to yourself because
you are going to be lying to yourself, and that's one thing you've got to face up to the facts that any human being is going to have prejudices and they're going to have a nasty side to them. They're going to,
and you're always going to favour your own as well.
And you're always going to favour your own. Yeah. And the more you accept it and come to terms with it, the less likely you are to do anything terrible about it.
Most definitely.
So we need to, self-awareness, knowing yourself, is one of the big challenges that studying something like the Holocaust puts in front of you.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons also I wanted to have you on there, just so I can get a deeper understanding and also my listeners and viewers can get a deeper understanding of what it is, because I'm sure loads of them have had their same prejudices. Loads of them have viewed Jews, viewed black people, viewed white people, viewed everyone else apart from themselves as the person causing them drama and heartache. Yeah. And how do we get away from that? Like, how do we as a society live more harmoniously without blaming the other for their problems?
I guess, in a way, the answer is fairly obvious. It is just look at people for what they are. Don't think about them as being black or white or Jews or Muslims. Just look at them and see how they're behaving and judge them according to that. And in a way, everybody knows that. So even in a situation like Nazi Germany, everybody, or actually one of the big Nazi leaders made a speech once, and he said, look, the point of the speech was to say, we've really got to murder them all. Wow. And he said, look, now and then, everybody will say, yes, I understand, we've got to do this. But actually, I've got a Jewish bloke who lives next door to me, and he's great.
He's cool, yeah.
He's great, And that's the attitude, yes? So as soon as you know somebody, those prejudices and the stereotypes fall away because you just deal with them, like the person next door is like, you either like him or you don't or whatever, but you don't really care if they're from Poland or or America or wherever. So it's when you find yourself thinking about people as if they're all the same, well, they're not. They're not. And it's interesting that in Nazi Germany, they needed to come up with definitions about who's a Jew and who isn't a Jew. Yeah? And they could hardly do it because it's too difficult. Is it somebody? I mean, obviously, if it was somebody, both their parents were Jews, they went to synagogue regularly. Then fair enough. That's certainly someone who's Jewish. But if there's only one Jewish grandparent and they've never set foot in a synagogue in their lives, is that a Jew or isn't it? And what do you do about their children? It gets too complicated too quickly, and they never did solve that problem. So the idea of thinking in these racial categories is just rubbish. It's rubbish. It's not, doesn't correspond to the reality of what people are.
Most definitely. I mean, I'm always, it's an idea that I'm always enforcing to others. I'm like, judge a man by their character, because I mean, I always go by the Martin Luther King speech. Exactly. I think what he was advocating for was individuality. He said, it's not meritocracy we live in here. Judge a man by his character, and then, or a woman by her character, and based on that, you you decide whether you're going to have relations with them or
Yeah.
not.
Yeah.
It's not about grouping people and then just subjecting them to their group treatment, because that's not how we're supposed to live as a society, and it causes more heartache than anything. So for simpletons, so this was a question someone asked me when I told them I was coming to see you. They said, "What's the difference between a Jew and a Zionist?" And I said,
Interesting.
And I said, I don't know.
Okay.
I honestly just put
But it's a
my hand
very important question,
It's-
especially now.
It's very important question,
Yeah,
especially
yeah.
with what's being spilled out there now. And
Yeah.
that's when I thought, okay, I'm gonna hold on to it. I'm not gonna. I didn't have time to do the research, but I'm gonna ask you, because I would assume you're a Jewish man, aren't you?
I'm not a Jew.
Oh, you're not a Jew. Okay.
But there were Jews in my family.
In your family, okay.
So, but I'm not a Jew. No,
Yeah.
No.
What is that difference?
Okay, so being a Jew is primarily a matter of practicing a religion. Zionism was a political movement that started in Austria, in Vienna, in the 1880s or 90s, and it was a political movement that said, Jews are a people that haven't got a country, and we know they originally come from Palestine, and we want to go back there and set up a country there, and that's Zionism.
Okay.
And so now Zionists are people who believe in the state of Israel. Yeah. And a lot of people, since the Holocaust, it's quite difficult to just come out publicly and say, I really hate Jews, and I wish they would all go away or they'd die or whatever. But you can say, I've got nothing against Jews, but I'm really against Zionists. Yeah. And it's like a little diversion.
Yeah. You're going round and roundabout, basically.
You're going round, but you end up
Coming
in the
out
same.
back,
You end up in the same road. So by saying it's not the Jews, but the state of Israel is not legitimate, and the Jews should leave the state of Israel, and you've got to ask yourself, why do they say that about Israel when they don't say it about any place else? Yeah. And there's obviously a terrible conflict going on in Israel between Palestinians and Israelis, but that conflict is actually pretty small beer if you compare it to conflicts going on in other countries where hundreds of thousands of people get killed every year, and nobody pays any attention at all.
Yeah.
Look at Central African Republic or the Congo or whatever. The civil wars going on there are killing thousands and thousands, and maybe tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of women being raped, or children being forced to fight, or these things. But nobody wants to know about that. All the attention is on Israel and a very intense, very nasty conflict that's going on there. But above all, it's actually very small.
I think it's small in terms of like the atrocities and stuff, but I think the political connections is what makes it bigger. It's on the right side of politics in terms of where people's eyes are and where people's ears.
No, clearly, all the attention is on it. But if you've got to ask yourself, why is that? Why are we so bothered about what goes on there when we couldn't care less what goes on anywhere else?
Yeah.
And the reason is it's Jews. It's Jews. That's why all the attention is on them. And it's a tiny wee country, completely surrounded by loads of other countries with huge populations, all dedicated to eradicating the Jews in Israel. And it taps straight into all the anti-Semitism that there has been for the last 2,000 years. And Zionism is just a code word for anti-Semitism. That's what it's become. It's not in the originally. Literally, it was a little political movement, And whether you think the state of Israel is legitimate or not is up to you. But, you know, from a European perspective, it's difficult to see how, after the Holocaust, you can refuse to let them have somewhere to live, a country to call their own.
Yeah.
We owe it to them, actually, as Europeans, because we were either slaughtering them or we were standing around watching them get slaughtered. So we have an obligation. We've got a moral obligation.
Yeah. That's a question for someone else to answer one day, I guess.
I think so.
Yeah.
Well,
so before we go, I just wanted to touch on your family as well. You said you have an interesting background in regards to your relationship with
the whole subject area.
Subject,
so my on my mum's side of the family, my mum had a grandfather who was a Jew, and he was living in Berlin, and they were talking about sort of 1880s.
Yeah.
You know, he was a lawyer and he was doing quite well, and they made him into a judge. And at that moment, he converted and became Protestant. So he became Christian.
Okay.
And I don't know why he chose to do that, but I think it was just expected that you as a Jew, you can't really be a judge. You've got to become a Christian before you can be a judge. So he did that. And he had 4 children, 3 daughters and 1 son. So they were all raised as Protestants. But the 3 daughters all underwent religious conversions when they were young women. So the 2 older ones converted to Judaism. So they went back to Judaism, and they underwent education and the ceremonial things and so on. And then one of them went to Palestine in 1933. The other one had gone the previous year, I think. So very early. So, you know, long before it was Israel.
Yeah.
And the 3rd daughter became a Roman Catholic nun.
Oh, wow. That's a real mix up there.
It's a real mix.
Yeah.
And then there was the 4th child, that was the boy, who was my granddad.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And he never had a religious conversion at all, so he was sort of officially he was Protestant, and I imagine that actually he was completely indifferent to religion. So the 2 girls who went to Palestine, one of them stayed there for her whole life, and she's buried out there, and so on. Got married, but they never had any kids, and so on. But the other one, for reasons that I'm not clear about, came back to Germany in 1937, which wasn't such a great idea.
Yeah, that's just before.
She had to, for some reason, she had to go back. And then she went back to Berlin, and actually she married in Berlin and married a Jewish bloke. And she was working as a teacher in a school, little private Jewish school, because at a certain point all Jewish kids were expelled from state schools. And so these little private schools started up for Jewish kids to get an education, and she actually taught in 2 of those. And then at the end of 1942, she and her husband were told they were going to be deported, and they ran away and hid. And at that point, they were getting help. They were getting money and help from the sister who was the Roman Catholic nun. So she knew what was going on, and she gave them money, and she gave them you had a little ID card from the post office that would let you get rations and stuff like that. So she gave them that stuff, and they were hidden for about 4 or 5 months, and then everybody got arrested, and the nun was sent to a concentration camp called Ravensbrück. That was concentration camp outside Berlin that was just for women. And the other one, the one who had been married to the Jewish bloke, she was sent first to a ghetto called Theresienstadt or Terezin in what's now Czechoslovakia, and then near the end of 1944 she was sent to Auschwitz and murdered there. And her husband actually killed himself when they were arrested. So, and my granddad, he was also a teacher, and he taught Greek, Latin and German. And up until 1943, he was allowed to teach Greek and Latin, but the Nazis said, no, you're not racially pure enough to teach German. Wow. So he was forbidden to do that. And then after 1943, they carted him off to a slave labour camp, but he survived that.
Oh, wow.
So that was my mum's side. And on my dad's side, my grandfather, he didn't serve in the army, but he was in a special organisation that had to do with supplying the army with food. And he was in I think it was in Latvia at a time when some of the worst slaughtering was going on there. So I've not really been able to find out, whether he saw it or if he was taking part in it or what. I don't know. So this, those are the sorts of reasons why once I started working at the Wiener Library, it started to become sort of meaningful for me, and I was getting more interested, and I wanted to try and understand everything.
Did you have
better.
the backstories that you just told
No,
me before?
No.
Oh, wow.
I found all of that out much more recently.
Yeah. And is that all through working at the library as well?
Yeah.
That just shows me how amazing history is in terms of piecing together even your own true story.
Well, that's the other thing. If you don't know history, then you don't know who you are. Yeah. Actually, you do
Most
need,
definitely.
and you need to know who you are. You really do.
Yeah.
Otherwise you can't act or live properly at all.
Most definitely. That's actually a beautiful way of ending this first segment here, because I mean I'd really like to catch up with you another time and just continue this conversation, but initially
Anytime.
This was a great piece to start as an introduction into the Holocaust and your life personally, and also what we can take from history, because the last piece they just said has actually really hit me now, because I just thought back, like, do I really know the depths of my family history? No, I really don't.
And as I can tell you for with complete certainty, as you find out more, it changes you on the inside. It changes you,
Most definitely. Because even something simple as whenever I go back to Ghana and I visit family in the rural places, like not like the ones that live in the city that I talk to on WhatsApp, but the ones that I have no communication with whatsoever, and I look at them and they look exactly like me. They look like my dad. They look like my granddad or whoever. It hits me. I'm like, wow, this is a piece of me, because as human beings, and in particular family, we're connected. Like, we're connected in way bigger ways than you would assume on a superficial level. And when I see family and I look directly into their eyes, I feel something. So I mean, that's one thing I'm going to take back now and just try to understand my own personal history. And I'm going back to Ghana very soon in a couple of weeks as well, so it's another opportunity for me to further understand history, and in terms of like my family, where I come from, and who I am as a lineage, not just who I am now. Really appreciate it, man. It's
makes
been an absolute
a
pleasure.
difference. Brilliant.
Thank you for coming on this.
Thank you.
podcast.